Hey everybody, this is Mike with Free Roaming Photography, and I'm going to run through what I've learned from doing 1 year of bird photography. And hopefully if you're getting started or you just want to learn a few new tricks, this video will help you with just that. So just a reminder, I also offer private photography workshops in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. So I can give all this to you in person, as well as many other things as we look for birds or wildlife or really anything else you want to find in the area. Also, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And without further ado, here we go. So the first thing I've learned is to use an extender sparingly. Whether it's a 1.4 or a 2x extender, it's not always ideal to have it on. I personally wanted to keep my 2x extender on as much as possible because I was trying to really get that extra focal length on the smaller birds. But the compromise you have to make is that you're going to have to crank up that ISO more and more to compensate, because what happens is, yeah, your focal length is going to get multiplied by that extender. So if it's 1.4, you're going to have 1.4 times whatever your longest focal length is. 2x, you're going to have double your focal length on whatever lens you're put it on. The problem is it's also going to multiply your aperture. So if you have, like I do, a 500 millimeter lens f4, sure, you get 1,000 millimeters, but you also have to crank it up to f8, and that's the lowest you can go. So to compensate, you got to raise up that ISO, and it's not always worth it, especially in low light situations. So let's say you're shooting before sunrise or after sunset, or you just have a really dark overcast day. It's really not worth that extender, because the higher you go with ISO, the lower your image quality. And it's much more important to make sure you get a good quality image within the camera versus cranking up all the settings and just assuming that it'll be better with noise reduction software, which, granted, does a great job these days, but it's not always in good practice, or it doesn't always work out the way you think when you rely on it. So let's say you have a light overcast day, or you have some nice sunrise light to work with. Sure, go ahead, put it on. It makes a great addition, but it's very tempting to have it on all the time, but don't fall into that trap. Secondly, shoot for more than just birds sitting on trees. While you definitely want to take those opportunities while they're there, it's much more interesting if you catch them doing something behavioral. It can be just scanning the ground, looking for food, or it can be them singing, where you get their beak open, you get them looking up, doing something like that. And it creates a much more interesting photo than if you just have something like a bird just sitting there on a tree looking out. And certainly those can make beautiful photos as well. But it's always more engaging when you have your subject doing something, whether it's a bear, moose, bird, whatever. If it's performing some kind of action that you can relate to, that creates a more interesting photo pretty much always. And if you can catch a bird flying, great, do it. But the problem is that can be extra challenging. It's certainly doable, but going into the details of how to accomplish that are beyond the scope of this video, so that's probably going to be the subject of a future video. So be sure to like and subscribe to get updated when that comes around. Now, something to avoid are just plain sky backgrounds where you just have a blue sky or an overcast sky or something like that. It's the least interesting background you can have in a bird photo. I'm not saying don't ever shoot a bird with a sky background. If you have a good opportunity, always take it. But if you can, try to find a way to make that background more interesting. Whether that's, maybe you have a bird flying overhead, maybe it's waterfowl and it's flying toward some body of water. Try to get that bird flying down lower and maybe even landing. That'll make a much more interesting photo than just with the sky behind it every time. Similarly, maybe you have a bird high up in a tree. That bird's not going to stay there forever, so see if it hops down to a lower branch. Maybe it goes down to hunt on the ground, moves around a little bit. In whatever case, maybe it's you moving around, or maybe it's just waiting for the bird to move. There's likely a better opportunity if you just hold out for just a second. Now, similarly to the last tip, the next one is to avoid overly busy backgrounds. This happens a lot when you have a bird in a tree or a bush and there's just branches and leaves everywhere. A lot of times what happens with that is that your subject winds up getting lost with all the distractions. So to avoid distracting backgrounds, what you want to do is, like with any wildlife photography, you want to isolate your subject, in this case a bird, from the background. You want to put as much distance between that bird and whatever's in the background as possible. And what that does is that pops the subject out from whatever's going on around it a lot more. So that way, anything that is in the background isn't distracting, it's just sort of more back there. Now, in order to accomplish this might be just a matter of you moving over a little bit. One of the best things to do is just to stay still. If you have a bird you really want to photograph and it's kind of tucked away in a bush, for example, give it a respectful distance. Don't stand right next to the bush, obviously. But if you just stay still, eventually it'll be a little more comfortable with your presence and it might start hopping out and giving you a little bit more opportunity. When that happens, you can wait for it to hop onto a more exposed branch or just some kind of perch that looks less busy than deep inside of a bush. So the next tip is to dial in all your settings to capture a bird in flight. Now, a lot of modern cameras have great technology built in that wasn't available 10 years ago, which tracks birds and other wildlife phenomenally. And it can even look for the eye, it can track their behavior and predict if they're going to fly towards you or side to side or something like that. And it makes getting those birds in flight shots much easier. But with that being said, it can also vary. If you're wanting to photograph bald eagles or pelicans or something that's much larger, you don't need the tracking to be as sensitive as you do for maybe a sparrow or a hummingbird or something like that, which moves much more rapidly. Now, getting into the details of this is beyond the scope of this video. So again, this is probably going to be the subject of another video coming soon. So just stay tuned for that. And moving on to the next tip, always keep a high shutter speed. This is to make sure you always capture a bird moving around. Even if it's just sitting still on a branch, you never know when that bird's going to just start flying away. So you want to have a high shutter speed to freeze that action and to freeze those wings, especially smaller birds. You want to make sure you have a high enough shutter speed to freeze those wings. And usually what I'm shooting for is at least 1/2000th of a second. That's enough, even for small birds, to make sure their wings aren't blurry or anything like that. And certainly you can catch some nice looks with blurred wings, or maybe the background's moving with them as you're tracking them as they're flying. But 99% of the time, you're going to want to freeze that action, and keeping a shutter speed of 1/2000th or quicker will make sure that happens. Now, if you're in low light situations, obviously you're going to try to have to work with what you got. And you can go a little bit lower. Just remember that the slower you go from 1/2000th of a second, even if it's 1/1250th of a second or something like that, is you're going to risk blurring those wings, and they're not going to be just as quite as sharp as they could be. But again, low light, you got to do what you can. So probably want to crank that ISO up if you're in that kind of a situation. So next is learn the migrations. Whether they're common birds that you see or birds that you've heard about, or maybe that you saw an eBird that were in the area, learn the migrations, because that'll help you understand if they're going to be leaving or not, or if they're going to be staying there year round, or if they're even a rare encounter. That way, if the fall's coming up, you know which birds you want to focus on, because maybe you didn't get enough shots of a certain bird. You don't want to wait all winter for them to come back. You can go focus on them, knowing that some of these other birds that you keep seeing are going to be there year round. And related to the last tip, learn a lot of bird calls, especially the common ones that you see a lot in your neighborhood. What that'll do is, if you have a whole bunch of birds that are calling around you, if it's a busy area, it'll help you pick out the ones that you don't quite know and you don't see very much. If you know the common ones, you can tune them out and try to figure out where the ones that are unfamiliar to you are, and you can focus more on them and capture something that you don't normally get. And then lastly, get out there. Have fun with it. Practice, practice, practice. That's the best thing you can do. Especially with birds, it's so easy because you don't have to go to a national park on the other side of the country. You don't have to go visit some deep wilderness. You don't have to go to another country. Birds are everywhere. They're in your backyard. They're in your city parks, county parks, state parks, whatever. You can go anywhere and find birds. And in doing so, you get all the practice you need to try to become better at doing bird photography. So you can practice on birds in flight. So let's say you want to get better at shooting birds in flight. You got robins pretty much everywhere. You got all sorts of other things like that. So that's the great thing about bird photography, is that since birds are everywhere, you can practice all you want on them, and you get better and better. So that way, when you do go to somewhere new and you see all sorts of new rare birds, you're ready to effectively capture them because you've practiced so much. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you have any other questions or comments, please leave them down in the comments below. If I missed anything or you want to add something useful, definitely leave that down in the comments below as well. And if you're interested in coming on a private photography workshop with me in Grand Teton or Yellowstone National Park, look for the link down in the description, and we'll go out, we'll talk about photography and birds and really any other wildlife or anything you want to do out here. So thanks for watching and happy trails.